The border wars in Texas between the hordes of illegals, the federal government, and the state of Texas is continuing to ramp up. Rapid-fire developments have occurred while the Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals have both issued opposing rulings on whether Texas's new deportation law would be allowed to continue. So here's where we are at today. Recently, there was a Supreme Court ruling where the U.S. Supreme Court allowed Texas to enforce a state law known as SB 4, which would enable state law enforcement officials to arrest and potentially deport individuals who have entered the country illegally. This decision was made without a detailed explanation from the court, although Justice Amy Coney Barrett, joined by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, wrote a concurring opinion indicating that the Supreme Court would not intervene at this stage because the lower court's order that the Biden administration had sought to block was part of the appeals court's power to manage its own docket. Now, there was a public response to this. Texas Republicans celebrated the Supreme Court ruling on social media, while the Biden administration and immigration advocacy groups expressed their concerns about the implications of SB 4 on immigration enforcement and foreign relations. Even Elon Musk stepped into this fray, tweeting this out. He said, "Crazy that Texas has to do the job of the Biden administration, which filed aggressive legal action to stop the state. If anyone still doesn't believe that ushering in illegals is the goal of the Biden administration, this should convince them." Now, naturally, this decision didn't go over well with those who want endless streams of people crossing into the U.S. border. For example, the Mexican government was angered by the threat of having those who illegally crossed into the U.S. from their border possibly being returned. And so the Mexican government condemned the Texas law as discriminatory and a violation of human rights, stating that it would not accept anyone sent back by Texas under SB 4. But it didn't matter because the victory here for the state of Texas was short-lived. In fact, just a couple of hours after the Supreme Court made the ruling, the Texas bill was blocked yet again, this time by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. They blocked the enforcement of SB 4. And the decision came late Tuesday, effectively reinstating the ruling from U.S. District Court Judge David Ezra, who had previously concluded that SB 4 conflicted with federal immigration laws and the Constitution. The Fifth Circuit's order to pause SB 4 will remain in place until the court rules on Texas' request to allow the law to be enforced while the appeals court considers its legality. So what were the legal arguments here? Well, the Biden administration has argued that immigration enforcement, including arrests and deportations, is a federal responsibility, and that SB 4 conflicts with federal law and the Constitution. Texas, on the other hand, though, is arguing that SB 4 is necessary to address the crisis at the border, pointing out, and I believe rightly so, that the federal government is allowing a mass invasion at the border and refusing to not only stop it, but actively sabotaging the state of Texas's effort to slow or stem the tide. Texas is arguing that the state has the right to arrest people for entering its state illegally. So, what happens next here? Well, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals is set to hear arguments on the matter, and whatever decision is made, the status of the law is likely to end up back before the Supreme Court, meaning we're going to have to do this all over again. So how did we get here, and why should you care what happens at the border? Well, for those who have not been following this ongoing story for the past few months, here's the general gist of what's been taking place on the border so far. The flood of illegals crossing the border into the U.S. has been steadily ramping up for years. Some estimates now put the estimated number of people here in the U.S. illegally north of 22 million. In fiscal year 2023 alone, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or the CBP, recorded more than 2.4 million encounters at the southwest border and more than 3.2 million encounters nationwide. This is just 2023. This data, by the way, includes encounters of individuals attempting to enter the country illegally between ports of entry, as well as those presenting themselves at ports of entry without proper authorization. The New York Times reported that for the second year in a row, the number of illegal crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border surpassed 2 million people. I want you to let this sink in. This past year, 3 million people crossed our border. That's roughly the same amount of people that are born in this country every year. This is a staggering figure, and it is entirely unsustainable. And unlike legal immigrants coming into the US, specifically those wanting to become citizens who have a desire to become part of our culture and to assimilate by going with our laws and going through the process of becoming legal citizens, the overwhelming majority of these people crossing the borders are remaining apart. They are balkanized. This creates an incredibly dangerous situation. It is a figurative time bomb for this country. Now, what makes me say this? Well, let me give you an example. Let's talk about a recent illegal alien caught crossing our borders. You have a Lebanese man, Basil Ebedi, 22 years old. He was apprehended by the U.S. Border Patrol near El Paso, Texas, back on March 9th of this year, after illegally crossing the border. During his custody, he admitted to being a member of Hezbollah, which is a terror group backed by Iran. And he expressed his intention to, quote, try to make a bomb in New York. However, in a subsequent interview, Ebadi tried changing his story and claimed that he was just attempting to escape Hezbollah in Lebanon, stating that he didn't want to kill people, and highlighted the difficulty of leaving the organization once joined. He revealed that he had undergone 7 years of training focused on jihad and had actively guarded weapon locations for 4 years. And so despite his initial admission, internal U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, documents indicated that he was marked for deportation, though his destination country was unspecified. Sounds a little bit disturbing to me. Maybe we'll call it deeply troubling. And it is also worth noting that if this is not an isolated incident, my friends, there has been a surge of illegal crossings of people on the terror watch list entering the U.S., with 98 encounters in fiscal year 2022, which nearly doubled to 172 in fiscal year 2023. And mind you, these are only the ones that we are encountering, that we know about. No one really knows how many have been slipping into this country. This is not good. This is bad. And that's not all. The disdain for the U.S. and our laws, including the ones our federal government are seeing fit to ignore and to not enforce, is growing as those crossing the border have been emboldened by the clear willingness of the Biden administration to not only tolerate this mass migration at the border, but to also welcome them here. And so it should come as no surprise that we have social media posts, like the man I'm going to show you here, an illegal alien who went viral on social media saying this.
Mi gente, he pensado invadir una casa en United States, ya que me enteré que existe una ley que dice que si una casa no está habitada, podemos expropiarla. Capichi, muchachos, aquí en United States también se aplica la de invasión de terreno. Y creo que ese será mi próximo negocio. Invadir casas abandonadas. Ya que me he buscado unos códigos con mis amigos africanos. Y me dijeron que ya llevan como 7 casas expropiadas. Y como dice el dicho, papi, hay que buscar la vuelta. Y la vuelta ahorita mismo es invadir casas. Ya que nos encontramos en situación de calle y es la única manera que tenemos para no vivir en la calle y no ser una carga pública. Capichi, la ley dice que las casas abandonadas, deterioradas y que esté en mal estado, podemos llegar y repararlas, vivir en ellas y si podemos venderlas, hasta pedir créditos con ellas. ¿Qué dicen ustedes?
Now, this is untenable, but the U.S. government doesn't seem to care about what damage that happens to people like you or I. The reality is there is a purpose and a reason behind why our leaders in Washington continue to sit idly by, no matter how many people are harmed or killed by this flood across our border. So we might be asking ourselves, well, why would they not want to protect the country from this invasion? Well, the obvious conclusion we can draw here is that there must be some benefit that our government thinks outweighs whatever risks and chaos and or destruction that might occur. So what could that be? Well, let's take a look at this opinion piece by Lysandra Gomez. She's pretty upset that Elon Musk supported what she angrily calls an idiotic propaganda video. Let's read from this article. She said, Elon Musk said this is actually actually happening, sharing a propaganda video by the ex-account Western Lensman that claims Democrats are providing shelter, services, and food to migrants as part of a long-con plot to strengthen their voter base with grateful left-leaning Latino immigrants, or as the video puts it, ensuring their loyalty to the political party that imported them. Musk, of course, she says, is a powerful, influential man, and his share quickly brought the video nearly 4 million views on X, or Twitter. Billionaire financier Bill Ackman joined Musk, saying of the video, "I find this credible," and asking, "What are the best arguments one can make against the case the video makes?" To answer this, she quoted podcaster Jon Favreau, who took up Ackman's challenge, refuting what one commenter called child-level propaganda, with a 7-bullet response, which Favreau admitted was not comprehensive, but only, quote, some, end quote, of the arguments that can be made. So here's what Favreau said. He said, "I'm shocked. The guy who thought Dean Phillips would win Michigan finds Elon Musk's propaganda video credible. Here are some arguments, Bill." 1, says Favreau. It is illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, and they don't because you need a license or social security number to register. Well, first things first here, John. I don't know if you know this, but there are already municipalities in this country in 3 states, and municipality, for those who don't know, means cities and towns, are already allowing non-citizens to vote in their local elections. And secondly, the current ability for illegals to vote in state and federal elections isn't what really matters here. No, instead, it is the inevitable passing of amnesty that people should be concerned about, which will happen at some point. And if and when it does, it will fundamentally change the U.S. overnight, especially considering there are 22 million illegal aliens in this country now. In fact, I've covered this topic in a previous video here on this channel. There have been numerous attempts at granting the massive influx of illegals in this country. Let me give you some examples. Let's go back to 2001. The Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, otherwise known as the DREAM Act, was first introduced. This proposed legislation aimed to provide a pathway to legal status, which is just a nice way of saying amnesty, for illegal immigrants who came to the U.S. as children, under certain conditions. It didn't pass, but that was the introduction. Fast forward to 2006, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act was passed by the Senate, although the House would not take it up. Although the House would not pass this bill, but it included provisions for increased border security, which was just a rehash of the fake securing of the border that was part of the original amnesty that was granted back in 1986 under Ronald Reagan. Now, for those who don't know this, in 1986, we granted amnesty to 3 million illegal aliens in this country with the idea that we would solve the illegal immigration once and for all, and everyone would become citizens that were eligible, and that way we would secure the border. Never happen again. That's right. 3 million illegal aliens were granted amnesty in the 1980s. And as part of that bill, by the way, you know the whole border wall fight? Well, that was part of that bill. It was supposed to have been built back then to keep this from happening all over again, which of course it has, because guess what? The border wall never was built. So let's move on here, shall we? 2007. Another attempt at comprehensive immigration reform was made with the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act of 2007. Despite having bipartisan support and backing from President George W. Bush, the bill failed to pass in the Senate. At the time, there was a lot of blame on loud voices on the right, like then talk radio show host Rush Limbaugh, who was a catalyst for driving attention to what was happening here. Now let's move on to 2013. You had the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act of 2013, which is more often referred to as the Gang of Eight bill. It was passed by the Senate. And in this, they had comprehensive immigration reform, which included provisions for border security, visa reforms, and a pathway to citizenship, which is again just a nice way of saying amnesty for illegal immigrants. However, it was not taken up by the House of Representatives and did not become law. Then there was DACA and DAPA, which in 2012 and 2014, respectively, President Barack Obama introduced to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, and Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents, or DAPA programs, through executive actions. While not legislative acts of amnesty, these programs aimed to defer deportation for certain undocumented immigrants. DAPA, though, was blocked by the courts and never implemented, while DACA has faced legal challenges and attempts at termination. Then there were the various DREAM Act reintroductions. Remember that one from back in 2001? Well, the DREAM Act and similar legislation aimed at providing legal status to illegal immigrants brought to the U.S. as children have been reintroduced several times since 2001, including efforts in 2010, 2011, and beyond. However, none of these attempts have yet resulted in the passage of the DREAM Act into law. The point to all of this is, the attempt at making these tens of millions of illegal aliens into citizens with fresh voting rights for state and federal elections is almost certainly going to be within reach, and at some point they will get their way. Now, I don't believe John can really be this stupid to not know this. Surely he knows that this has been happening. So either he is actively gaslighting his readers and listeners into thinking that, no, or maybe he really is just that dumb. Either way, it's not a good look. So let's go back to John's fancy list here. He says, number 2, all mail-in ballots are verified in every state. 95% of non-citizen growth went to red states since 2019. Let's see. You got, if non-citizens, number 5, weren't counted in the census, Texas, Florida, and California would each lose 1 seat. And then number 6, demographics have not been destiny for Democrats. The party's advantage with voters of color is at its lowest point in 60 years, driven by a rightward shift among Latinos. And number 7, if Biden and Democrats believed the idiotic assertion that illegal immigration would help their party, the president probably wouldn't have deported more undocumented immigrants than Trump did, and he probably wouldn't be campaigning on a conservative Republican bill that would temporarily shut down the border. Now, my friends, number 7 is just plain stupid. Politicians do this all the time. The temporary shutdown of the border would do nothing in the long run to stop more fresh illegal immigration coming in, just like the border security provisions in the amnesty bill from the 1980s didn't either. It's simply there to put ill-informed people's minds to rest that surely Big Daddy government here is going to protect us. But aside from all that, let me address number 6 on his list, where he said the demographics have not been the destiny for Democrats. And sure, we could argue that we see a very recent shift in Black and Hispanic voters away from the party of Biden. But let's take a step back and get a 10,000 foot view of what's really going on here. And let's look at real world data, okay? I want to point out California, one of the largest states in the union today. And let's see what amnesty did for that state. Let's go all the way back to 1986. There was the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which is also known as the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, and it was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in November of 1986. It provided a pathway to legal status for certain illegal immigrants who had entered the United States before January 1st, 1982. Now, while the exact number of illegal immigrants living in California who became citizens as a result of the 1986 amnesty is not specified in search results I've looked into, it is noted that an estimated 3 million individuals, mostly of Hispanic descent, gained legal status through Simpson-Mazzoli Act. Now, California, having a large illegal immigrant population, saw a significant number of its residents become eligible for legalization. This included both those who had entered the country illegally before 1982 and certain agricultural workers. Now, what this would lead to would be an increase in legal immigrant populations. By 1993, California's population included as many as 7.4 million foreign-born individuals, of which 1.6 million were from amnesty. Okay? This represented a significant portion of the state's population and highlighted the substantial impact of the Simpson-Mazzoli Act on California's demographic composition. This demographic shift had political implications over time. For instance, there was Proposition 187 in 1994, which sought to deny public services to a new surge of illegal immigrants. You see, after you granted amnesty the first time, now more people were incentivized to come to the country because, hey, maybe they'll do it again. And this is cited as a turning point that alienated many Latino immigrants from the Republican Party at the time and led to a surge in Democratic voter registration. This fact suggests to us that the political landscape in California began to shift towards the Democratic Party in the years following amnesty. And importantly here, prior to amnesty in 1986, California was kind of viewed as like Texas is today, a bit of a purple state. You had 1976, Republican. 1980, Republican. 1984, Republican. And 1988, they also went Republican. However, that would be the last time. The shift blew would become dramatic. By the 2000 election, California was 53% voting Democrat, and by 2020, that number had increased to 63.5%. This, my friends, is the real reason why the flood of illegals crossing the border is not only being tolerated, but encouraged today. Instead of 3 million people, there are now upwards of 22 million in the US. Imagine what would happen if amnesty were granted today. Not only would it do nothing to stop the endless surge of fresh new illegals going forward, because again, you haven't stopped people from coming in, and now you're granting another 22 million people citizenship. What do you think is going to happen? But aside from just incentivizing more people to come here illegally, it would almost certainly shift political power generationally towards the Democratic Party on a national level. As Jon Favreau himself pointed out, he said 95% of non-citizen growth went to red states since 2019. Do you think that that's not on purpose? To me, it sounds like the easiest way to flip a red state blue overnight. Our two-party system, if amnesty were granted today, would be over. No matter how many legal citizens over time might shift back to the Republican Party, they would easily and always be able to be overridden by fresh millions more illegals crossing the border every year in perpetuity going forward. Perpetual power would be at hand for the Democratic Party. The representative republic model would be broken by the sheer volume of new citizens who would lack any loyalty to the founding of this country, which I believe is the purpose of all of this. Now you might be asking me, well, don't they understand the risks of endless people crossing the border and what that could cause to this country? That surely they must be aware that chaos is coming. Well, to that I say, I believe they do know, but I also think that they truly believe that what they are doing not only is right, but they are going to use it to break down our old system, tear it down, completely get rid of the model that we have today. I mean, you constantly hear them saying, our founding was bad, we're a nation of flaws, we need to be reworked, right? So if you can tear all of that away, then when you could, with this many new voters simply overriding the American people, then they would be able to rebuild it in their own new image. And whatever harm that they might cause, well, they could just fix it later. I'm sure they believe that what they are doing can be justified, that free people are just too chaotic and stupid for their own good. If they could just get average citizens to comply with being controlled properly, then everything would be fine. But this is precisely how you destroy a free society and turn it into a dystopian dictatorial nightmare. This is the future if this is not stopped. Everybody needs to be aware of this. And that, my friends, is going to bring this episode to a close once more. From the To Be Frank Show, I am Adrian. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.